The first cry echoed through the still air of the clinic, sharp and frantic, a desperation that cut through the sterile walls. As Dr. James lifted the ragged cardboard box from the back seat of his car, he felt his chest tighten. Inside, wrapped in the remnants of torn fabric, was a dog, small, dirty, and shivering with cold, its eyes wide with fear. No collar, no name, just a fragile heartbeat beneath a mangled coat of fur. "Another one," he whispered to himself, setting the box down gently. The dog's eyes locked with his, unblinking, hollow. It wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten. In the dim light of the examination room, the weight of its fate pressed heavily on his chest. Who would leave a creature so helpless? But as he reached out, fingers trembling, the dog didn't flinch. It seemed to surrender, as if waiting for a savior. Little did Dr. James know, this was the moment that would alter everything. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. The clinic, typically a sanctuary for both the animals and the people who sought its help, was quieter than usual. Dr. James had just finished a long day of treating pets and was looking forward to heading home. He had been on his feet for hours, performing routine checkups, administering vaccines, and stitching up cuts and bruises. But when Clara, the clinic receptionist, walked in with a cardboard box in her arms, his plans for a peaceful evening vanished. "Dr. James, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaky. Her face was a mask of concern, and there was an edge of helplessness in her eyes as she held out the box. The box itself looked like it had seen better days, the edges bent, its sides weathered and worn. But what was inside it was even more distressing. A small, fragile dog lay curled within the cardboard confines, its fur matted and wet, its eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. It was as though the dog had been abandoned by the world itself. No collar, no identification, just an empty stare that seemed to pierce Dr. James' heart. Clara had found the dog outside, curled up on the cold concrete behind the clinic, likely abandoned in the middle of the night when the streets were empty and no one would hear its desperate cries for help. The dog had been left in a box. No blanket, no care, no warmth, just discarded like a piece of trash. There was something about the sheer cruelty of it that made Dr. James' stomach churn. How could anyone do this? The dog's coat was matted with dirt, its ribs visible through its thin frame. Its small body trembled violently as it huddled in the box, every movement a silent plea for help. Dr. James could see it, the fear in its eyes, the terror it must have felt in those last moments before it was left behind. Abandoned. Forgotten. "Clara, get me a towel and some warm water," he said, his voice more urgent than he intended. He placed the box on the examination table, the dog's eyes never leaving his face. The animal was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unwilling to trust. There was a rawness in its gaze, an emptiness that made Dr. James' heart ache. He gently reached out, not wanting to startle the animal, but needing to assess its condition. The dog flinched when his fingers brushed its fur, a quick, involuntary movement that revealed just how fragile it had become. It was as though the dog was too broken to even believe that someone would try to help. Dr. James carefully lifted it out of the box, holding it with both hands as if it were made of glass. The dog's body was stiff, its trembling becoming more pronounced as it realized it was being touched, held. He looked down at the small creature in his arms, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. The dog needed warmth, food, and immediate care. As he placed it on the examination table, Clara returned with the towel and water, and together, they began the delicate process of cleaning the dog's fur. The poor thing was covered in dirt, and the water quickly became a murky brown as they worked. It was clear the dog had been out there for some time, likely left to fend for itself in the cold and rain, the world offering no solace. Dr. James didn't speak as he worked, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. He was no stranger to these kinds of cases. He had seen many animals come through his clinic after being abandoned, mistreated, or left behind. But there was something different about this one. Something in its eyes. It wasn't just fear, it was defeat. This dog had been through something traumatic, something beyond the physical scars that were visible. It had been abandoned, left to die in a world that had no place for it. And now, it was here, alone, scared but alive. And that was something worth fighting for. As the dog slowly began to relax under his touch, Dr. James found himself wondering about its past. Who had left it here and why? What had it gone through to arrive at this point? Had it been someone's pet? Or had it been a stray from the start? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers. Just an empty stare that seemed to say everything and nothing at once. The room fell silent except for the soft rustling of the towel as Dr. James gently cleaned the dog's matted fur. He could feel its tiny body shaking in his hands, its heart beating rapidly in fear. But there was something else too, something subtle, something that made him pause. A flicker of hope. In those eyes. The dog wasn't completely lost. There was still life in it. Still a spark that hadn't been extinguished. The only question now was whether he could help reignite that spark before it was too late. Clara stood quietly to the side, watching Dr. James work. She had seen many animals come through the clinic in similar conditions, but this one felt different. The way the dog had looked at Dr. James when it was first brought in. The way it had not recoiled, but just looked at him, as though it knew he was its last chance. It wasn't just an animal needing care. It was a soul in desperate need of something far more profound: compassion. Dr. James finished cleaning the dog's fur and wrapped it gently in the towel. As he sat down beside it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this little creature had been abandoned for more than just survival. It had been abandoned for hope. Its eyes were full of it, though it was barely perceptible. And as he stroked its fur, Dr. James whispered softly, "You're safe now. You're not alone anymore." The dog, for the first time since he had brought it in, looked up at him. It didn't flinch. It didn't retreat. For just a moment, its eyes softened, and Dr. James could feel the tiniest flicker of trust in that gaze. And in that moment, he made a promise. He wouldn't let this dog fall through the cracks. He wouldn't let it be forgotten again. It wasn't just a job for Dr. James anymore. It was personal. He would save this dog, no matter what it took. The days that followed were filled with the quiet hum of the clinic, punctuated only by the occasional sound of paws against the floor or the soft murmur of Dr. James' voice as he gently spoke to the dog. Chance, as Dr. James had started to think of him, wasn't recovering as quickly as he'd hoped. Though his physical wounds had begun to heal, the emotional scars ran deep. Each day Chance would lay in his bed, eyes closed, trembling, unwilling to eat or drink. James had seen this before in animals who had been abandoned, mistreated, or neglected for too long. The trauma wasn't just physical. It was in their very being. It was in the way they moved, in the hesitation they showed toward anyone who offered them kindness. But Chance was different. Despite the terror in his eyes, there was something in him, a spark, that wouldn't be extinguished. It was as if he were waiting for someone to prove that there was still love to be found in the world. The first few days after Chance's arrival, Dr. James found himself becoming more and more absorbed in the dog's care. He would check on him every few hours, speaking softly, offering food and water, but Chance never touched any of it. He wouldn't even acknowledge the food in front of him, his body curled into itself, the weight of his past too much for him to bear. The vet's frustration grew as he watched the dog's progress stall. But what frustrated him the most wasn't that Chance wasn't eating. It was the fact that the dog had no interest in connecting, no interest in trusting. In a way, James couldn't blame him. Trust was something that couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. And Chance, who had been so brutally betrayed by someone he should have been able to trust, needed time to rebuild that foundation. But the lack of progress weighed heavily on Dr. James' heart. He couldn't help but wonder, what was it about Chance that felt different from all the others? Why did it feel like this was his fight to win? There were moments, though, small and fleeting, when Chance would respond to Dr. James' presence. When he sat beside the dog's bed, Chance would lift his head slightly, his eyes watching him with a wary, almost questioning look. But the dog would quickly turn his head away, as though trying to distance himself from any connection. It was a subtle rejection, but it stung. One evening, after a long day of seeing patients, Dr. James returned to the clinic to find Chance exactly where he had left him, curled up on his bed, eyes closed. The room was dim, the only light coming from the low glow of the overhead lamps. As Dr. James stood by the door, looking at the small, fragile dog, a wave of empathy washed over him. He had spent so much of his life focused on saving animals in a clinical, almost detached way. But this was different. This was about healing a soul, not just treating an injury. He walked over to Chance's bed, crouching down to the dog's level. He didn't reach out immediately. Instead, he just sat there watching him. The quiet was soothing but also filled with tension. There was no noise in the clinic except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional sound of Chance shifting in his sleep. Doctor. James felt his heart ache for the dog. He couldn't imagine what Chance had been through to end up like this, abandoned, alone, with no one to care for him. In that moment, Dr. James decided to try something different. He had been so focused on getting Chance to eat, to drink, to respond. But maybe what he needed was simply a moment of connection. Not forced, not rushed, but natural. He slowly reached out, his hand hovering just inches from Chance's trembling body. He waited. His heart raced as he wondered if Chance would allow him to touch him, if he would even notice his presence. It felt like an eternity, the seconds stretching into what seemed like minutes. And then, slowly, Chance lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting Dr. James' gaze. There was something in those eyes, something so deep that it made Dr. James' chest tighten. The dog didn't pull away. He didn't shrink from the touch. It was as if, for just a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that this man, this stranger, might be someone he could trust. Dr. James didn't reach out immediately. He wanted to give Chance the space to decide for himself. Slowly, carefully, he inched his hand closer until, finally, it rested gently on the dog's back. The moment his fingers made contact with Chance's fur, the dog tensed but didn't pull away. The tension in the room was palpable, and Dr. James felt it in every fiber of his being. He had reached a turning point. Whether Chance would accept him, or whether this was another step in a long process of healing, he didn't know. But for now, this was enough. For the first time since he had arrived, Chance didn't flinch. He didn't recoil or cower. Instead, he simply stayed still, allowing Dr. James to stroke his back, his fur matted with the remnants of his past. There was no sudden change, no miraculous recovery. But the act of allowing this man to touch him was something that signified a willingness to trust, even if only a little. And that was a huge victory. Dr. James sat there, his hand resting gently on Chance's back, until the dog finally let out a soft sigh. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that the dog was starting to relax, to let go of some of the fear that had held him in its grip. Slowly, the trembling that had once been constant began to subside, replaced by a quiet, hesitant calm. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. The days following the small breakthrough with Chance were a mix of quiet hope and profound struggle. Dr. James had seen this type of slow progress before. Animals that were broken in spirit as well as body, animals that seemed to have lost everything but their will to survive. But Chance was different. Each moment of progress seemed to be met with an equal amount of setback, a reminder of just how deep the dog's trauma ran. Despite the small signs of improvement, Dr. James couldn't help but feel the weight of Chance's recovery hanging over him. He wasn't just treating a body. He was trying to heal a heart that had been shattered beyond measure. The dog had been abandoned, discarded like an old piece of furniture, left to fend for itself in the harshest of conditions. That kind of emotional trauma wasn't easily fixed by a few gentle words or kind hands. For the first time in his career, Dr. James found himself grappling with an emotional exhaustion that went beyond his usual compassion for his patients. He wasn't just dealing with a medical case anymore. He was dealing with a living, breathing creature that had been betrayed by the very hands that were meant to care for it. He couldn't shake the image of the dog lying in that cardboard box, vulnerable and alone, its eyes full of silent pleading. James had always prided himself on being a problem solver, on being able to figure out what was wrong and fix it. But with Chance, the answers didn't come as easily. The physical wounds had started to heal. The dog's fur was less matted and it had started to eat and drink more regularly. But the emotional scars were deep, so deep that Dr. James felt powerless to fix them. One evening, after another long day at the clinic, Dr. James sat by Chance's side, watching as the dog lay on his bed, still as ever, eyes fixed on the floor. The quiet of the clinic was interrupted only by the soft clicking of the clock on the wall and the occasional rustle of Chance's fur as he shifted uncomfortably. Dr. James could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, the uncertainty of how much longer it would take for Chance to open up, to let go of his past. He couldn't help but think about how much he had given to this dog. His time, his energy, his heart. And yet Chance still seemed so distant, so broken. James had been patient, he had been kind, but in this moment, he was beginning to question if it was enough. Would it ever be enough? The doubt lingered in his mind as he watched Chance, whose once fearful eyes had softened only slightly. The dog would occasionally glance up at him, but then quickly look away, as though ashamed of showing any vulnerability. It was as if he were afraid that by trusting Dr. James he would only be hurt again. Dr. James had learned to recognize the signs of trauma in animals, but this was something different. This was a pain that couldn't be easily fixed with a few medications or a comforting touch. This was a pain that ran so deep, so far back, that it seemed to define the dog's very existence. The fear in Chance's eyes wasn't just a response to the present. It was the echo of everything he had endured before. That night, Dr. James sat in the stillness, watching Chance as he slept fitfully. The dog's body twitched occasionally, as though reliving the horrors of his past, and Dr. James could only wonder what those dreams must be like. What nightmares haunted this dog's every breath? Was he remembering the cold streets, the loneliness, or the hands that had discarded him like trash? It was in that moment, as Dr. James sat beside Chance, that he realized how much he had allowed himself to invest in this animal. It wasn't just about saving a life anymore, it was about redemption. The dog needed more than just food and medicine. He needed a chance at a new beginning, a chance to feel loved again. But how could a dog like Chance ever truly believe that love was real? The next day, Dr. James made a decision. He knew that he couldn't just keep treating Chance like any other patient. He needed to become more than a vet to this dog. He needed to become the person who showed Chance that it was safe to trust again. That was the real healing that had to happen. Not just in the body, but in the heart. For the next few days, Dr. James spent every free moment he had with Chance. He would sit with him quietly, not asking for anything in return, just being present. He didn't try to push the dog into any form of interaction or affection. Instead, he simply let Chance come to him when he was ready. The dog began to stay by his side more often, though still at a distance. He would occasionally nudge Dr. James' hand with his nose, a small sign of progress. But it was still slow. One afternoon, as Dr. James was sitting by Chance's side, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The dog's tail, which had remained motionless for days, twitched. Just once, but it was enough. Dr. James didn't want to get his hopes up, but it felt like a breakthrough. A sign that Chance was beginning to allow himself to feel again, to let down some of the walls he had built around himself. For the first time, Dr. James allowed himself to believe that Chance was capable of recovery, that maybe, just maybe, he would find his way back from the depths of his despair. But there was still so much work to do. The path to healing would be long and fraught with setbacks, but Dr. James knew that he couldn't give up on this dog. He wouldn't. The next few days were a whirlwind of small victories. Chance began to eat more regularly, and while his trust in Dr. James was still fragile, it was becoming more evident with each passing day. Dr. James was learning to navigate the dog's emotional landscape, understanding when to push and when to give him space. The dog was still afraid, but he was beginning to respond to Dr. James' presence in a way that felt less like survival and more like an invitation to trust again. It was a slow, painful process, but the more Dr. James witnessed the small shifts in Chance, the more he realized how far they had come together. The dog wasn't just healing physically, he was learning that love, in its purest form, could be given without condition, without fear. The days blended into weeks, and Dr. James found himself working tirelessly, not just as a vet, but as a caretaker for a wounded soul. Each moment he spent with Chance brought him closer to understanding the complexity of the dog's healing. Chance had made remarkable progress physically. He was no longer the frail, trembling creature who had been dropped off at the clinic, abandoned and broken. His fur had begun to regain its softness, and the hollow look in his eyes had been replaced with something new, a faint glimmer of hope. But despite all the positive changes, Dr. James knew the real battle was far from over. The emotional scars were still present, lingering like an invisible weight around the dog's spirit. Chance had started to wag his tail again, but only occasionally, when he felt truly comfortable. He had learned to take food from Dr. James' hand, but it was still done with hesitation, as though every bite was a test of trust. It was a delicate dance. James had learned that patience wasn't just about giving Chance time. It was about giving him space to heal on his own terms. He couldn't rush it, couldn't force Chance to embrace his new reality. But the small steps of progress had started to add up, and for the first time in a while, Dr. James allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since the day Chance had arrived: hope. One afternoon, after a particularly long shift, Dr. James walked into the clinic to find Chance lying on his bed, staring out the window. The dog's posture was no longer tense, but instead relaxed, his body stretched out comfortably. For a moment, Dr. James simply stood there, watching the dog. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The dog had started to learn how to simply be. He wasn't constantly on edge anymore, constantly afraid. It was as if, for the first time, he was letting go of the weight of his past, even if just for a moment. Dr. James approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment. As he reached Chance's side, the dog looked up at him, his eyes soft, a hint of recognition in them. It was a small shift, but it was the first time Chance had looked at him like that. Without fear, without hesitation. It was as though the dog was seeing him for the first time as someone who was there to help, someone who could be trusted. Without thinking, Dr. James reached out, his hand hovering just above the dog's head. Chance didn't flinch, he didn't pull away. Instead, he simply lay there, calm, accepting the gesture of affection. For a brief moment, Dr. James hesitated, unsure if the dog was truly ready for this level of connection. But then, he lowered his hand, gently placing it on Chance's head. The moment his fingers brushed the dog's fur, there was a deep sigh, a content, almost relieved sound. It was as though Chance had been waiting for this all along, waiting for someone to show him that it was safe to feel again. Dr. James smiled softly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This was progress, real progress, and it was a victory, no matter how small. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Despite this moment of calm, Dr. James knew that Chance was still fragile. He had come so far, but there were still deep-rooted fears that lingered beneath the surface. The trust that had been built was delicate, like a thread that could snap at any moment. Dr. James was committed to helping Chance, but he also understood that healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't as simple as fixing an injury. It was about rebuilding a life, one tiny piece at a time. Over the next few days, Dr. James continued to spend time with Chance, allowing him to heal at his own pace. He would take the dog on short walks around the clinic's grounds, letting him explore at his own speed. Chance still moved cautiously, his steps tentative, but each time he took a few more steps forward, Dr. James saw a little more confidence in him. He was no longer hiding in fear. He was testing the world, one footfall at a time. It wasn't just the walks that marked a change. It was the way Chance began to interact with Dr. James. He started to nuzzle his hand more often, and sometimes he would follow the vet around the clinic, his tail wagging ever so slightly. There were still moments when Chance would retreat to his bed, curling up as though seeking protection, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. It was clear that the dog was beginning to see Dr. James not as a stranger or a threat, but as someone who could be relied upon, someone who was there to care for him. One evening, as Dr. James sat beside Chance, who was lying contentedly on his bed, he reached for the dog's paw, something he hadn't dared to do before. Gently, he held it in his hand, feeling the warmth of the dog's body beneath the fur. For a long moment, Chance didn't pull away. He didn't shy from the touch. He simply lay there, calm, allowing Dr. James to hold his paw, as if accepting the simple, unspoken promise that he was no longer alone. The connection between them was still fragile, but it was growing stronger with each passing day. As Dr. James held Chance's paw, he reflected on how far they had come together. When the dog first arrived at the clinic, he had been nothing but a scared, trembling animal, abandoned and alone. But now he was slowly beginning to believe in the possibility of safety, of love, and of healing. It wasn't an easy process. It had taken time, patience, and a deep understanding of what the dog needed. But in that quiet moment, Dr. James knew that they had both made it through the worst of it. Still, the journey was far from over. There were days when Chance would revert to old behaviors, when the fear would creep back into his eyes, and when the weight of his past would resurface. But Dr. James was ready. He knew that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and he was willing to walk that journey with Chance no matter how long it took. Dr. James rose from the bed and stood beside the dog, watching as Chance looked up at him, his eyes full of trust. There was no fear now, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding between them. In that moment, Dr. James realized that the dog had taught him just as much as he had taught Chance. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about being there, being present, and letting time do its work. And as he gazed down at Chance, his heart full, James knew that they were no longer two strangers in a clinic. They were partners on a journey of healing, each step taken together, side by side. The transformation in Chance was subtle, almost imperceptible at times, but it was real. With each passing day, Dr. James noticed the small changes, how Chance's eyes softened when he looked at him, how the once deep tremors had become more occasional and less intense. It was as though the dog was slowly learning to trust not just Dr. James but the world around him, inch by inch, moment by moment. There was no magic cure, no quick fix to erase the trauma that had defined Chance's life up until that point. It was all a process, a slow, painful, and often frustrating process. But with each tiny breakthrough, Dr. James allowed himself to believe that they were on the right path. In the mornings, Dr. James would arrive at the clinic to find Chance already awake, lying quietly on his bed, watching him with calm eyes. There was no longer the frantic energy of a dog in distress, no longer the desperate need to run and hide from everything. Chance was learning to be still, learning to be content in his own space. And that, for Dr. James, was the greatest victory of all. It wasn't just the physical recovery that marked Chance's healing. It was the emotional progress that was truly remarkable. The dog began to approach Dr. James more often, nudging his hand or sitting at his feet as though seeking attention. He had started to wag his tail again, though it was still a tentative movement, as though testing whether or not it was safe to be happy. But each time it happened, Dr. James could see the flicker of joy in the dog's eyes. It was like watching a flower bloom in slow motion, delicate, fragile, but full of potential. There was one afternoon, several weeks into Chance's stay at the clinic, when Dr. James had finished his rounds and decided to take a short break. He sat in the staff room, sipping coffee, but his mind kept wandering back to Chance. He couldn't help but think of how far they had come, how much they had learned from each other. There was a bond between them, unspoken but undeniable, something that had formed without either of them really realizing it. The dog had shown him what it meant to be patient, to trust without expecting anything in return. And in turn, Dr. James had shown Chance that it was okay to be vulnerable, to accept help when it was offered. When Dr. James returned to the main clinic area, he found Chance waiting by the door. The dog was sitting calmly, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on him with a quiet anticipation. It was a small thing, but it struck Dr. James deeply. For the first time, Chance wasn't hiding, wasn't retreating. He was waiting for him, eager for his presence. And as Dr. James walked over to him, the dog stood up and slowly walked toward him, tail wagging ever so slightly. "Hey there, buddy," Dr. James said softly, crouching down to the dog's level. Chance nudged his hand, then looked up at him, those dark eyes filled with a mixture of affection and curiosity. There was no fear in those eyes anymore, just a quiet understanding. Dr. James hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was real, if this moment was as significant as it felt. Then, without thinking, he reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. Chance leaned into the touch, his body relaxing against Dr. James. For a brief moment, the world outside the clinic seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, man and dog, a pair that had found something precious in each other. No words were needed. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. There was a trust now, an unspoken bond that had formed between them. It was stronger than any of the medical procedures or treatments that had taken place in the clinic. It was built on something deeper, something more profound. Dr. James smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He had spent his life healing animals, but this was different. This wasn't just about mending broken bodies, it was about healing hearts. And in that quiet moment, Dr. James realized that Chance had taught him something he hadn't expected: the power of quiet companionship, the value of simply being present for someone else. As the days passed, the bond between Dr. James and Chance deepened. The dog had started to trust him completely. He no longer flinched at Dr. James' touch, no longer pulled away when he offered food or water. Instead, Chance began to seek out Dr. James' presence, following him around the clinic as though he had finally found a safe place in the world. One evening, after a long day, Dr. James sat in the clinic's small yard, watching as Chance explored the area. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass, and the evening air was cool and crisp. Chance wandered slowly, sniffing the ground, his body relaxed, his tail wagging gently. He would glance back at Dr. James from time to time as though checking in, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He was free to be a dog again, free to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. As Dr. James watched Chance, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had spent so much time focusing on the dog's physical recovery that he hadn't fully realized how much Chance had grown emotionally. The dog had learned to trust again, to love again, and in doing so, he had taught Dr. James the true meaning of healing. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about learning to accept love, even when it seemed impossible, and giving it freely in return. Chance trotted over to Dr. James and sat down beside him, resting his head on the vet's knee. There was a softness in the dog's gaze now, a quiet sense of contentment that hadn't been there before. Dr. James scratched behind Chance's ears, his heart swelling with affection. It wasn't just that Chance had survived, it was that he had learned to live again, to embrace the world with hope and trust. And in the process, Dr. James had rediscovered the power of connection, the strength that could be found in the unspoken bonds between two souls. The world outside the clinic may have been full of uncertainty, but here, in this small, quiet space, Dr. James knew that he had found something real, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had made a difference, not just in Chance's life, but in his own. They had healed together, and that was something worth cherishing. For Dr. James, the days had started to feel like a long, quiet battle. The physical progress Chance had made was undeniable. The dog had gained weight, his coat was softer, and his energy had returned. But the emotional scars were still there, lingering beneath the surface. Chance was no longer the frightened, trembling animal who had first arrived at the clinic, but he was also far from healed. The dog had learned to trust, but the trauma of abandonment had carved a deep wound into his spirit that couldn't be erased with food, shelter, or medicine alone. Dr. James spent his days tending to the physical needs of his patients and the nights with Chance, doing what he could to bridge the gap between fear and healing. He would sit by the dog's side for hours, offering comfort without expecting anything in return. And though Chance had grown more affectionate, there were still moments when he would retreat, curling up on his bed and looking at Dr. James with those wide, uncertain eyes. The dog would watch him, but not approach. It was as though, in the quietest moments, Chance would retreat back to the darkness of his past, the place where trust was a foreign concept and love was something that could be taken away without warning. There were still days when the fear crept back into Chance's eyes, days when the weight of his past would pull him back into himself, when he would withdraw from Dr. James and the clinic's familiar surroundings. The dog had learned to interact with people again, but there was still a barrier. He would wag his tail and accept food, but it wasn't always with the same enthusiasm or comfort as it had been. There were moments when Chance would glance over his shoulder at the door, as if expecting someone to come and take him away again. It was in those moments that Dr. James felt the weight of his own battle. He was not just treating an animal, he was trying to help a creature who had been broken so completely that the very act of healing seemed like an impossible task. For the first time, Dr. James realized that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about showing the broken pieces that they could be whole again. It was about offering something more than just physical care. It was about offering the possibility of trust, of a future where fear no longer held sway over every action. But there were no guarantees, no quick fixes. Chance's journey was far from over. In many ways, it felt as though the hardest part was just beginning. James could see the glimmers of hope, the small moments when Chance would seek out his attention, the times when he would nudge his hand or sit by his side. But those moments were still fleeting. Trust was not something that could be rebuilt overnight, and Dr. James knew that he couldn't rush it. The battle wasn't just external, it was internal too. One evening, after another long day in the clinic, Dr. James sat on the floor beside Chance's bed, watching as the dog lay there still, almost motionless. It was the first time in days that Chance had withdrawn so completely. He hadn't eaten much that day, and he hadn't been as engaged with Dr. James as usual. The quiet moments were often the hardest for the dog, the moments when he had time to reflect on his past, to wonder if the kindness he had been shown was real or just temporary. Dr. James could see it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the brief flash of fear. Dr. James reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the dog's fur. Chance didn't flinch, but he didn't lean into the touch either. He simply lay there, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. It was as though he were trying to disconnect from the world around him, retreating back into the dark place where he had been abandoned. Dr. James felt a pang of helplessness. He wanted so desperately to reach the dog, to show him that he was safe, that he was loved. But there was still a part of Chance that couldn't fully accept that love, a part that was terrified of it. For a long time, Dr. James sat there in the silence, his hand resting gently on Chance's back. He thought about the journey they had both been on, the long road to recovery, the moments of doubt and fear, and the tiny victories they had shared along the way. He had seen Chance at his most vulnerable, at his lowest, but he had also seen the dog's strength, the quiet resilience that had kept him alive despite everything. And that was what gave Dr. James hope. But as the evening wore on, the silence between them grew heavier, the weight of it pressing down on Dr. James' chest. He had spent so much of his life treating animals, trying to fix their bodies, their wounds, and yet, this was something different. This was more than just a physical injury. It was the deep, soul-crushing impact of abandonment. It was the feeling of being forgotten, of being alone in a world that had nothing to offer. And in that moment, Dr. James realized something that had been staring him in the face all along. He couldn't fix Chance. He couldn't erase the past or undo the damage that had been done. But he could offer him something more powerful than that. He could offer him time. Time to heal, time to trust again, and time to believe that there was still love left in the world for him. With that realization came a sense of peace. Dr. James knew that this wasn't a battle that could be won with quick fixes or immediate results. It was a long, slow process, and sometimes it felt like they were making no progress at all. But each day, each small moment of connection, brought them closer to the truth that they could heal together. As Dr. James sat there in the quiet of the clinic, watching Chance slowly relax, he knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be setbacks. There would be days when Chance would retreat into his fear, and there would be days when Dr. James would feel the weight of his own exhaustion. But he also knew that there was something worth fighting for. There was a dog who had been abandoned and forgotten, and together, they would rewrite that story. Chance wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future, one where trust was possible again, where love wasn't something to be feared. And Dr. James would be there every step of the way, not as a healer but as a companion. In the battle to heal a broken soul, they were in it together. The weeks drifted by, each one bringing its own small victories and setbacks. Dr. James found that healing wasn't a straight line, but a winding road full of unexpected detours and lingering doubts. Each day with Chance felt like a step forward, but some days it felt like they were taking 2 steps back. But James had learned something invaluable during their time together. Healing was a slow process, a patient process. It wasn't just about treating the dog's body. It was about giving him the space to heal emotionally, giving him time to learn how to trust again. One of the most challenging aspects of caring for Chance was learning how to be patient, not just with the dog but with himself. Dr. James had always been a man of action, someone who liked to fix problems immediately, to find solutions and move on. But with Chance, that wasn't possible. The dog's healing process was not something that could be rushed. It had to happen at its own pace, and that was something Dr. James had to come to terms with. Chance had come a long way since that first night when he had been dropped off at the clinic. He was no longer the trembling, frightened dog who had refused to eat or drink, who had flinched at every touch. Now he would eagerly wait for Dr. James to arrive each morning, his tail wagging gently when he saw the vet. He would sit beside him during his breaks, sometimes resting his head on Dr. James' lap, enjoying the simple comfort of being close to someone who cared for him. There were moments when Chance would play in the clinic yard, chasing after a ball or running around the perimeter of the fence. He wasn't the same dog who had been left behind in a box on a rainy night. But even as Chance's behavior improved, Dr. James knew there was still more work to be done. Despite the progress, Chance still had moments of fear, moments when he would retreat back into the shadows of his past. There were days when the dog would avoid eye contact, would hide in the corner of his bed, his body tense with the weight of the memories he could not escape. The trauma of abandonment, the hurt of being cast aside, had left a mark on Chance that no amount of love or care could instantly erase. Dr. James could see it in the way Chance would sometimes look at him, those fleeting moments of doubt, as though he was still unsure whether he was safe, unsure whether he could fully trust again. It was in these moments that Dr. James felt his patience tested most. He would watch as Chance withdrew, feeling the dog's hesitation like a physical force. There were times when Dr. James felt a deep sense of helplessness. He wanted so badly to make it all better, to erase the pain that lingered in Chance's eyes. But he knew that he couldn't. He couldn't force Chance to heal faster, to forget his past. All he could do was continue to show up, to be there for the dog, day in and day out, offering him consistency, compassion, and understanding. Healing, he realized, wasn't about doing. It was about being. One afternoon, Dr. James found himself sitting outside the clinic, watching Chance as he lay in the grass, soaking up the warmth of the sun. It had been a long day, and the clinic was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Chance was lying on his side, his eyes closed, the peaceful expression on his face a stark contrast to the fearful, anxious dog who had arrived at the clinic weeks ago. As Dr. James sat there, he found himself reflecting on the journey they had taken together. There had been so many moments of doubt, so many days when it felt like they weren't making any progress at all. But now, as he watched Chance, he could see how far the dog had come. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Chance had started to trust again, to believe that the world could be a safe place. He had learned to let go of his fear little by little and embrace the love that Dr. James had offered him. It wasn't just the dog who had been healing. James realized that, in many ways, Chance had healed him too. He had taught Dr. James the value of patience, the importance of slowing down and allowing the process of healing to unfold naturally. In a world that moved so quickly, where everyone was in a rush to fix everything immediately, Chance had shown him that some things took time. Real healing took time. It couldn't be rushed, and it couldn't be forced. It had to come in its own time, at its own pace. Dr. James smiled as he watched Chance roll over and stretch, his paws outstretched in the air. For the first time, Dr. James could see that the dog was truly at peace. He wasn't completely healed, not yet, but he was getting there. And Dr. James knew that, no matter how long it took, he would be there every step of the way. The bond between them had become something deeper than either of them could have imagined. It was more than just the bond between a vet and his patient. It was a partnership, a quiet understanding that they were both in this together. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clinic yard, Dr. James stood up and walked over to Chance. He crouched down beside him, gently running his fingers through the dog's soft fur. Chance looked up at him, his eyes full of trust and gratitude. There was no fear now, no hesitation. Just a quiet, unspoken bond. Dr. James leaned down and whispered, "You're doing great, buddy. We're in this together." Chance let out a soft, contented sigh, closing his eyes again as he relaxed into the touch. In that moment, Dr. James realized something important. Healing wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, however small, and the willingness to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. And so they moved forward day by day, step by step. There would be setbacks, there would be moments of doubt, but there would also be victories, however small. They were healing together. Patiently, slowly, but with the certainty that, in the end, they would both be whole again. The morning air was crisp as Dr. James stood at the clinic's entrance, watching the soft light of dawn spill over the yard. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows across the grass. Inside, the quiet hum of the clinic was a welcome contrast to the busy chaos of the outside world. But inside, it wasn't just the sterile walls and the sterile instruments that mattered. It was the life that had been brought back to the clinic. The life that was Chance. Dr. James watched as the dog, now a shadow of his former self, trotted through the yard, his tail swaying in time with his steps. His movements were more confident now, no longer hesitant and unsure. Chance's body had grown stronger, but his heart was growing stronger too. He was beginning to embrace his place in the world again, learning to trust, learning to play, learning to be. The long road to recovery was far from over, but the change in Chance was undeniable. The dog had become something more than just a survivor. He had become a companion, a friend, and perhaps even a healer in his own right. But Dr. James knew that the journey wasn't over. The emotional scars that lingered in Chance's heart weren't something that could be erased overnight. Despite his progress, there were still days when Chance would retreat into himself, withdrawing from the world and from those who cared for him. The trauma of abandonment still lingered, sometimes in the form of fear, sometimes as hesitation, and other times as a deep, palpable sadness that crept in unexpectedly. It was on one of those days that Dr. James truly began to understand the depth of Chance's recovery. The dog was lying in the clinic's yard, a few feet away from where Dr. James was working, but his eyes were closed, his body stiff. It wasn't the playful, curious dog Dr. James had seen the day before. Instead, Chance seemed withdrawn, his tail tucked between his legs, his body low to the ground. Dr. James watched him from the door, unsure of what to do. It was a moment that felt heavy, a reminder that even after all the progress, Chance was still grappling with the wounds of his past. The abandonment, the uncertainty of love, of trust, still haunted him. It was in those quiet, still moments when the past crept back, and it was in those moments that Dr. James realized just how much time and patience it would take for Chance to truly heal. He walked over to the dog slowly, not wanting to startle him. As he approached, he noticed that Chance's eyes were half closed, as if he were lost in thought, or perhaps still trapped in a memory. Dr. James crouched down beside him, speaking softly. "Hey buddy, what's going on?" Chance didn't react immediately, but after a few moments, the dog turned his head to look at Dr. James. There was a fleeting look of vulnerability in his eyes, as though he were trying to explain something without words. Dr. James felt his heart twist as he looked into those eyes. It was a familiar look, one that spoke of the pain of the past, the fear of being hurt again. The road to recovery wasn't just about physical health, it was about rebuilding trust, piece by piece, moment by moment. Without saying a word, Dr. James reached out, gently running his hand through Chance's fur. The dog tensed at first, but then relaxed into the touch, his body slowly unwinding. The transformation wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect, but in that moment, James realized something important. Healing wasn't about forcing the dog to overcome his past. It was about being there for him when those moments of fear surfaced, offering him a safe place to retreat to, a place where he could let go of his pain, if only for a moment. It was in these quiet moments that Dr. James saw the true strength of their bond. It wasn't always about the victories, the tail wags, or the playful moments. Sometimes it was about simply being present, standing beside the dog in his moments of vulnerability, offering a quiet, unspoken support. Dr. James sat beside Chance for a long time that day. He didn't try to force the dog to do anything. He didn't try to push him into playing or interacting. He simply stayed with him, offering the comfort of his presence. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Chance began to relax. His breathing slowed, his body softened, and eventually he lifted his head, gazing at Dr. James with eyes that had softened over time. It wasn't the same dog who had arrived in that cardboard box, broken and alone. It wasn't the dog who had trembled at every sound or shayed away from every touch. This was a dog who was learning to trust again, learning to be vulnerable, learning to open his heart. And Dr. James couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Not just in Chance, but in their journey together. They had both been broken at some point, but together they were becoming whole again. The next few days were filled with small steps forward. Chance began to play again. Lightly at first, a gentle chase of a ball, a tug on a rope. He would wag his tail when Dr. James entered the room, and when the vet reached for him, Chance would nuzzle his hand, eager for affection. It was clear that the dog was learning to live again, to enjoy the simple pleasures of life that had once seemed so distant. But Dr. James knew that there were still days ahead when the road to recovery would feel like an uphill climb. He knew that there would be moments when Chance would retreat, when the scars of his past would reemerge. But Dr. James also knew that they had come too far to stop now. They were on this journey together, one that was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges. But it was their journey, and it was worth every moment of struggle. As Dr. James sat beside Chance, watching the dog run across the yard, tail wagging, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. The road to recovery hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over. But in that moment, Dr. James knew that they had made it to the other side of something. They had both learned what it meant to trust again, to love again, and to heal together. Dr. James stood up and walked toward the clinic door, glancing back at Chance, who was now happily chasing after a toy in the yard. There would be setbacks, there would be fears to confront, but there would also be moments of joy, of laughter, of lightness. The road to recovery was long, but it was a road worth traveling. And with that thought in mind, Dr. James stepped inside, ready for the next day, ready for whatever came next. Because he knew that, together, they could face anything. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the clinic's yard. The air was warmed, but there was a coolness to the evening breeze that hinted at the change of seasons. Dr. James sat on a bench just outside the clinic, his thoughts drifting as he watched Chance playing in the yard. The dog was running with a newfound energy, chasing after a ball and wagging his tail enthusiastically, the joyful sound of his paws hitting the ground echoing in the quiet yard. It was a stark contrast to the frightened, hesitant dog that had been brought in just weeks ago. Chance's transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. When Dr. James had first laid eyes on him, the dog had been broken, both in body and spirit. He had been left in a box, abandoned and forgotten. But now, as Dr. James watched him run freely across the grass, there was no sign of the timid, frightened dog who had arrived in the clinic. Chance had found his confidence again. He had found his joy. And Dr. James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. It wasn't just the dog's recovery that made Dr. James proud. It was the journey they had taken together. From the moment Chance had arrived, Dr. James had vowed to help him heal. But what he hadn't expected was how much he would learn from the dog. Through Chance's vulnerability and courage, Dr. James had rediscovered his own capacity for patience, empathy, and love. The bond between them had grown beyond that of a vet and his patient. It had become something deeper, something lasting. As Chance ran around the yard, Dr. James couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment wash over him. It wasn't just about the dog's physical recovery. It was about what Chance had become. He was no longer the broken animal who had been abandoned and left to fend for himself. He was a dog with a future, a dog with a name, and a dog who had a place in the world. It was time for Dr. James to give him that name. He stood up from the bench and walked over to Chance, who had paused to catch his breath, his sides heaving with excitement. The dog looked up at him, tail still wagging, his eyes bright with joy. Dr. James crouched down in front of him, his heart swelling with affection. "You've come so far, haven't you, buddy?" he whispered, his hand gently resting on Chance's head. Chance leaned into the touch, nuzzling Dr. James' hand as if to say, "Yes, I have." The connection between them was undeniable now. It wasn't just trust that had been built, it was something deeper. It was the understanding that they were no longer two strangers. They had become companions, each offering the other something they needed. For Dr. James, it had been a reminder of the power of patience, of the healing that came from simply being there for someone. And for Chance, it had been a journey from fear and isolation to love and belonging. Dr. James smiled softly and looked down at Chance. "You need a name, don't you?" he said, more to himself than to the dog. He had thought about this moment for days. He knew that naming the dog would be a significant step in his recovery. It was the final act of giving Chance a new identity, a fresh start, and a future. Without hesitation, Dr. James reached for Chance's collar and attached the tag he had been holding onto for days. The name he had chosen for the dog was simple yet powerful. It was a name that spoke to the dog's resilience, his ability to survive against all odds. "From now on, your name is Chance," Dr. James said, his voice full of emotion. "You're here because of a chance. A chance to live, a chance to love, a chance to be who you were always meant to be." Chance tilted his head slightly, as though contemplating the name. Then, in that moment, something shifted. The dog's tail wagged a little harder, and his eyes seemed to brighten even more. It was as though he understood the significance of the moment, as if the name, Chance, had unlocked something deep within him. Dr. James stood up and gently led Chance back inside the clinic. The dog followed eagerly, his steps steady and confident. They walked together, side by side, not as a vet and a patient, but as two companions who had traveled a long, difficult road together and had emerged stronger for it. In the days that followed, Dr. James continued to observe the changes in Chance. He had come to life in a way that was hard to describe. The dog who had once been terrified of human touch, who had cowered in corners and trembled at the slightest noise, was now a dog full of energy, affection, and curiosity. He had made friends with the other animals at the clinic, playing with them during the day and resting peacefully at night. He no longer felt the need to hide from the world. He was embracing it. Chance was not just physically recovered, he had learned to be a dog again. He had learned to trust, to love, and to let go of the pain that had once consumed him. And now, as Dr. James watched him, he saw a dog who was no longer defined by his past but by his future. A dog with a name, a place to call home, and a life ahead of him. As Dr. James prepared to leave the clinic that evening, he paused at the door, looking back at Chance, who was curled up on his bed, eyes softly closed, a contented sigh escaping his lips. There was no fear in his face, no trace of the brokenness that had once defined him. He had found peace, and in doing so, he had found a new life. "Good night, Chance," Dr. James whispered, his voice full of warmth. The dog opened his eyes and looked up at him, giving a soft wag of his tail as if to say, "I'm home." It was a simple moment, but it was everything. It was a testament to how far they had both come. James stepped out of the clinic, his heart full of gratitude. He had been given a gift, a chance to help a dog who had been forgotten, abandoned, and left behind. But in the process, he had found something he hadn't expected, a reminder that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about giving someone the chance to start over, to embrace a new beginning, and to find a place where they could finally belong. And as Dr. James walked into the night, he knew that this was only the beginning for Chance. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, the future looked bright. For both of them. The clinic was quieter than usual, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound that filled the space. Dr. James had just finished his morning rounds, and as he made his way into the staff room, he glanced out the window toward the yard. The sight of Chance, playing freely in the grass, caught his attention, as it had many times before. The dog was different now, no longer the fragile, uncertain animal who had been dropped off in that cardboard box. This dog was strong, confident, and happy. And yet, despite all the progress they had made, there was still something looming in the background, something that Dr. James could no longer ignore. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions. The clinic had received a call from a local animal shelter looking for a family to adopt Chance. It wasn't unexpected. Chance had become healthy and well-adjusted, and the prospect of a new home was something Dr. James had prepared for. But despite knowing this day would come, the thought of letting go was still difficult. Dr. James had always believed that his role as a vet was to help animals find new homes, to give them a chance at a better life. But with Chance it felt different. It wasn't just about finding a home, it was about finding the right home, a place where Chance could truly feel loved and safe, a place where he could thrive. And for Dr. James, that meant something more than just sending the dog off to a new family. It meant knowing that Chance had found a place where he would be cared for, understood, and given the freedom to be himself. Chance had become part of Dr. James' life in a way that no other animal had. Over the weeks they had developed an unspoken bond, one that transcended their roles as vet and patient. James had watched the dog grow, had witnessed his transformation from a frightened, abandoned animal to a joyful, playful companion. He had seen Chance learn to trust again, to believe that love was something worth embracing. And now, as the time came to let him go, Dr. James realized just how much he had come to care for the dog. It was early afternoon when the family arrived to meet Chance. Dr. James had already prepared himself for this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. The family, a couple with 2 young children, were kind and eager to adopt Chance. They were excited to offer him a home, a place where he could run and play, where he could be part of their family. As they walked into the clinic, Dr. James felt a lump form in his throat. He had been through this before, watching animals leave his clinic and go to new homes, but this felt different. This was more than just a dog. This was Chance, the dog who had fought so hard to survive, who had taught Dr. James the true meaning of healing. And now, as he watched the family approach, he felt the weight of what was about to happen. Dr. James introduced the family to Chance, who greeted them cautiously but without fear. The kids were excited to meet him, kneeling down to pet him and offer him treats. Chance was hesitant at first, but he accepted their attention, wagging his tail slowly. The family seemed like a good fit. They were kind, patient, and willing to give Chance the time he needed to adjust to his new home. Dr. James watched as the family spent time with Chance, observing how the dog interacted with them. It was clear that they cared for him, that they wanted to offer him a good life. But as the moment drew nearer, Dr. James felt a knot in his stomach. He knew this was the right decision for Chance. He knew that the dog had come a long way, that he was ready for a new chapter in his life. But it didn't make it any easier. The bond they had formed, the quiet companionship, was something Dr. James wasn't ready to let go of. But deep down he knew that this was the true test for Chance. It was time for him to step out into the world, to find his place in a family, to experience life beyond the walls of the clinic. As the family prepared to leave, Dr. James stood quietly by the door, watching Chance as he walked toward his new family. The dog paused for a moment, turning to look at Dr. James, and for a split second, their eyes met. It wasn't the fearful look that had first arrived in the clinic. It wasn't the uncertainty or hesitation that had once defined Chance. This was something different. This was a look of trust, of gratitude, and of hope. It was as if Chance was saying goodbye, not in sadness but in peace. Dr. James smiled, his heart heavy with emotion. "You've got this, buddy," he whispered under his breath. "You've got a new life now." As the family walked out the door, Chance trotted beside them, his tail wagging gently. It was hard to watch him go, but Dr. James knew it was the right thing to do. The dog had found his place in the world. He had found his family. Dr. James stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching as Chance and his new family drove away. It wasn't just the dog that had changed over the past few weeks. It was Dr. James, too. Chance had taught him lessons that went far beyond veterinary medicine. He had reminded him of the importance of patience, of unconditional love, and of the power of second chances. As Dr. James walked back into the clinic, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't easy to let go of Chance, but he knew that this was what he had been working toward all along. Chance had found his new life, and in doing so, Dr. James had found a new sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had become a vet in the first place, to offer animals like Chance a chance at a better life.